Independent candidates will now contest for public offices at the provincial and national levels in South Africa, hitherto reserved for political parties. President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed the Electoral Amendment Bill, which has reinstated the country's valid Electoral Act. This move comes after a constitutional court in judgment in 2020 declared the Electoral Act unconstitutional because it required adult citizens to be elected to the National Assembly and provincial legislatures only through their membership of political parties. The president said this entrenches the country's democracy and widens its pool of leadership choices. However, there are those who have raised concerns about the act and worry rather than empowering independent candidates, it could worsen their ability to contest in elections. Today on The Square, we're going to get into this new act. My name is Keminni, Amanor, and you're welcome. Joining our gathering today are Vusi, Gumbi, who is a political analyst and research assistant at the University of Johannesburg. We also have Benedict, Phiri, who is a legal analyst at IusPrudentia Specialist Counsel in Johannesburg, South Africa. Gentlemen, you're welcome to The Square.
Thank you for having us.
Benjamin, I hope I got the pronunciation of your institution correctly.
Yes, it's IusPrudentia Specialist Counsel, but I think that was a very good try. Thank you.
Wonderful, and thank you for the correction there. I want to start off with you, Vusi. Talk to us about what this new electoral reform is all about and what it means for South Africa's democratic process.
Well, the background to the electoral reform is the fact that the existing proportional representation system made it impossible for members of parliament to exercise their constitutional duty of holding the executive accountable. The failure of the legislature to perform its critical task of holding the executive to account is because the proportional representation system gives political parties power over their deployees in parliament, and therefore members of parliament have all but little independence to perform their constitutional duties. So obviously the aim of this Electoral Amendment Bill, or rather the rationale behind the New Nation movement in 2020 to approach the Constitutional Court on the current electoral reform not being constitutional was largely informed by the fact that it has to allow independent candidates to run for office. And this is not a new thing in South Africa. In 2003, we had the Electoral Task Team report. In 2009, we had the Independent Panel Assessment of Parliament report. As early as 2017, the former President Kgalema Motlanthe led a high-level panel on assessment of key legislation and the acceleration of fundamental change, right? So the aim is to how do we include independent candidates to ensure that Parliament becomes responsive while ensuring that we maintain the PR system to make sure that the broad demographics of the population are represented. That was the rationale behind the amending the electoral bill. However, it is quite flawed in that it makes it almost difficult for independent candidates to run for office.
And I would want us to look at some of the pitfalls of this bill, but I want to move on to Benedict now. Benedict, I apologize. My attention has been drawn to the fact that I called you Benjamin, and your name is not Benjamin. It is Benedict Phiri. Benedict, let's talk about, the Concord ruling of 2020 and the electoral reform we are seeing, the amendment to the Electoral Act we're seeing this year, which has been assented to by the president. Is this what you were expecting?
Yeah, well, so if we go back to the Constitutional Court ruling, what the court did was it found that the Electoral Act was unconstitutional for not allowing independent candidates to constitute provincial and national elections outside of a political party. It gave Parliament a period of 2 years to fix the problem. And this is what has come out after a period that has extended for more than 2 years. Parliament has actually approached the Constitutional Court on a couple of occasions to have an extension for this act to be enacted. I think in theory, what has come out in the act is what we expected, in the sense that, yes, the amendment bill, rather if I call it that, does then create now a right for independent candidates to contest elections in those two spheres of government. But I think the practical application of it seems to suggest that, the political parties in Parliament, ANC, and a few of the other small ones that gave passage to this bill really were looking after their main interests more than the interests of these independent political parties and democracy in South Africa. And I think the big issue really stems from the fact that the Constitution entrenches that the electoral system will be broadly proportionally representative. But I think what has come out in the bill is more of an entrenchment of a system that won't allow independent political candidates the ability to have more than 200 seats, for instance. The barriers to entry and the manner in which they are to contest elections are relatively high. The constituencies themselves are fairly large and, do not allow for somebody who is an independent candidate to contest effectively without, for instance, financial muscle at the level that political parties will have. And also, where there are top-ups, because ultimately what you're trying to move to is a mixed proportional representation system that we see in the likes of, for instance, Germany and Korea and New Zealand. But what would happen here is that, where an independent party has not met the threshold for a seat in Parliament, those seats would be, or those votes would be given to political parties rather than independent candidates, which I think seems to suggest that in practical effect, you won't end up with the outcome that the Constitutional Court wanted. I mean, what the bill also tries to put in place is a body that would advise on electoral reform going forward that would be headed up by the Minister of Home Affairs. But its powers, according to the bill at the moment, are mainly just to advise and are not binding. So, it doesn't go far enough to giving effect to the spirit of what the Constitutional Court ordered almost 3 years ago now.
Doesn't go far enough. Now, Vusi, I know that Benedict has outlined a few of the flaws that have resonated with groups like the Independent Candidates Association. But talk to us in your own words what you think the flaws of this current act are. I mean,
this amendment bill creates an electoral system that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. It seems as though it was developed specifically to accommodate the judgment of the Constitutional Court by allowing independent candidates to contest elections within the existing proportional representation system without changing it. In South Africa, it's unlike what we expected, rather, was something similar to the local government elections, where you've got two separate ballots, one for proportional representation in the municipality and one for candidates in, communities, right? So, but what we have now is an unequal competition where political parties and independent candidates compete for the same votes. And that's not what the electoral trust team of 2003 envisioned, the 2009 panel, the Halima Motlanthe high-level panel envisioned. And definitely that's not what the Constitutional Court envisioned, because what we expected was the ability for independent candidates to contest in what is known as a constituency-based system, while political parties contest the proportional representation. Because now it creates an unfair playing field where independent candidates only contest for 200 seats out of the 400 seats in Parliament, but political parties then come and contest the 400 seats. That's one of them. Another is that this electoral system or this amendment bill leads to wasted votes, right? For example, if an independent candidate obtains around 120,000 votes, for instance, but maybe around 60, 70,000 votes are needed to get a seat either in the provincial legislature or in the National Assembly, it means that the proposed bill would discuss the rest of the votes once the independent candidate has reached the threshold to get a seat in the provincial legislature and the National Assembly. And the major thing here in those discarded votes is that not only does this lead to wasted votes, it means that these votes are aggregated to proportional votes where they will be shared amongst leading political parties, right? So this also becomes a contentious issue if you look into South Africa, where there are certain sections of society who are predicting a coalition government.
Right.
And to what extent will maybe a party like the ANC go below 50%? How much will they need to go over the 50+1? So if ever this government bill proposes to aggregate independent votes to proportional votes, it might create a scenario where political parties get seats that they did not get as far as votes are concerned.
Very well. Now, Benedict, as you rightly mentioned, the reforms also dictates that a panel is set up, and again, as you rightly said, to be led by the Home Affairs Minister. But what exactly will they be doing? What will their point of reference be as far as the elections are concerned post-2024?
Yeah, and I think that's the issue, because the panel, or at least the body that is being set up by the Electoral Amendment Bill, that will be headed by the minister, will only look at reforms post-2024. And that's an important consideration given what the political climate and landscape is going into the 2024 elections. And, my fellow panelist has mentioned the fact that coalition governments are almost a thing of reality going forward in South Africa. It's currently reality in a number of important metropolitans in the country. Firstly, the mandate only starts post-2024 for this body. And secondly, insofar as its powers to actually implement these reforms going forward as and when they come up, those are mainly advisory, and there isn't an ability to ensure that those are binding for the country going forward. So the question then will be, even if this panel or this body does come up with these suggestions for electoral reforms, how likely are those to be implemented at a speed which will meet the needs of South Africa from a democratic perspective, given what looks like at this point in time these political parties protecting themselves essentially insofar as the parliamentary processes and their ability to outnumber independent candidates in parliament. So there is a question mark around whether there actually is real political will through the creation of that particular body to actually see out these electoral reforms in reality. So I'm quite skeptical given the way that the bill has actually been drafted at the moment.
I see. Vusi, do you consider this panel necessary or problematic if you take into account the fact that there could be incumbency interference, if you like, for a panel that is headed by the Home Affairs Minister, as in relation to electoral reforms or electoral process? I don't know how you wrap your mind around that, Vusi.
No, certainly. I think my fellow panelist said it well when he said that we can't not look at the fact that this type of reform was meant to guard the interests of political parties more than creating a political environment where everyone, including independent candidates, are able to run. So obviously, once the Home Affairs Committee led by the minister starts this panel, we can't overlook the fact that there might be interference, because the power of political parties under existing political climate lies in the electoral system. And once the power is taken to the constituencies, or once we create a fertile environment where independent candidates are able to run for public office, to be members of parliament, that's when we'll see the power of political parties diminishing. And that's not what these political parties want, because that's how they're able to control their members of parliament, because they are able to propose them through a proportional list rather than them representing different constituents. So this is something that must be closely looked at, because obviously with organizations like Build One South Africa, the New Nation Movement, outright saying that they are going to approach the Constitutional Court to challenge the amendment bill, I do believe that they do have legal ground to stand on. Obviously, I'm not a legal expert like my fellow panelists, but I do believe that they do have a legal ground to stand on. And if ever the Constitutional Court, and this is what I believe rules in their favor, it will be interesting to see what kind of build-up we have heading into the 2024 national and provincial elections.
I see. Now let's come back to the elections that is ahead of us. I know that the panel took us a bit beyond 2024, but let's look at the 2024 elections. If these electoral reforms, particularly allowing independent candidates to contest at the provincial and national levels, are to be held, how ready do you think that the Independent Electoral Commission is to be able to implement the changes that come along with this new legislature or this new law, Benedict?
So I've seen reports that the Independent Electoral Commission needs approximately 18 months or so to prepare thoroughly for an election. And we have been in a similar situation with the local government elections that have passed recently, where there were court challenges to the processes, and the Independent Electoral Commission had a much shorter time to prepare for those elections. Some of the issues that came out was issues around voter participation, to say that there wasn't sufficient time to actually get people to the elections. So I think what will happen, though, is that should this application be made by interested private parties, as we've heard will be made to the Constitutional Court, it will certainly put pressure on those particular timelines, because the Independent Electoral Commission will obviously be uncertain as to what the outcome of the Constitutional Court process will be. And for that reason, the application must, in my view, be made directly to the Constitutional Court on the basis that Parliament hasn't given effect to the spirit and the substance of the order of the Constitutional Court. And perhaps we may have an order at some time before the end of this year. And the elections must be held between March at the earliest and August at the latest next year. And hopefully that would be sufficient time for the Independent Electoral Commission to ensure that the elections are prepared accordingly and everybody can participate. But certainly a court application at this stage of the process, and given how long that we're likely to get a ruling from the Constitutional Court, will certainly put pressure on the Independent Electoral Commission with respect to preparation for next year's general elections.
I see. When we come back from this break, I want us to look at some of the hurdles, legal and practical hurdles that the implementation of this new law could bring along with it. In the entire electoral process for South Africa. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Discussing electoral reforms in South Africa, and joining us for that discussion, Vusi Gumbi, who is a political analyst and research assistant at the University of Johannesburg. We also have Benedict Phiri, who is a legal analyst at IusPrudentia Specialist Counsel. Gentlemen, thank you for your patience in the program. Vusi, we ended with Benedict, so let's start off with you now. You said earlier that perhaps the civil society groups that are going to court may have a case. But my question to you is, do they have the time to be able to get the kind of ruling that they're looking for, given that the IEC also has limited period to be able to hold the elections, within which it should hold the elections in 2024?
I mean, I'm not sure if they do have time. Perhaps if push comes to shove, the IEC, the court, the Constitutional Court, Again, a disclaimer, I'm not a legal expert, but I'm thinking the Constitutional Court, if they don't have time to hold election while amending the electoral system, we may see a situation where the Constitutional hands out down a judgment that yes, the people who this current amendment bill is flawed and it must be changed. However, the judgment may be suspended for the next election and maybe then be applied at the next election. I think that's one of the possible ways of looking at it. I mean, we have seen instances where the Constitutional Court has handed down a judgment but suspended it so that it has given government time to effect the necessary changes. So we might find a situation where the IEC says maybe it does not have enough time to accommodate independent candidates through a constituency and a proportional representation system in one election. And therefore, maybe the court might say, okay, heading into maybe the 2029 elections, we must have a mixed electoral system. That's one way of looking at it, but I stand to be corrected.
I see. Benedict, I know you touched again on that, but what are your thoughts on whether or not there will be time to be able to do this?
Yeah, I think it's problematic that Parliament firstly did not meet the 2-year period that was given by the Constitutional Court to amend this piece of legislation. As I said before, Parliament requested 2 extensions, and even now the President signed this amendment bill a lot later than what should have been the case based on the latest extension received from the Constitutional Court. So I think it will be problematic if the Constitutional Court grants an order that effectively allows Parliament a further bite at the cherry to extend the matter. Obviously, the Constitutional Court has to be careful to ensure that it doesn't violate the principle of separation of powers. But what, in essence, you have is Parliament not giving effect to a Constitutional Court order. So I would certainly hope that the Constitutional Court can deal with this matter in an urgent and expedited basis so that the IEC can have as much time as possible to ensure that the elections are held in a timely manner in accordance with the law, and we don't have a scenario where the elections could potentially run over or that Parliament could not have given effect to a Constitutional Court order. It will be interesting to see what submissions are made by each of the parties when this application is brought, including the IEC. With respect to the last local government elections, the IEC made very cogent submissions to the Constitutional Court around how much time they needed to ensure that they were ready. And that gave the Constitutional Court some leeway and flexibility in ensuring that it crafted a practical order that would accommodate all the parties and would ensure free and fair elections in the country. So I expect a similar outcome in this particular process, but of course, that would be guided by the submissions of the parties in the court process itself, including the IEC.
I see. I want us to consider implementation of the law as it is, because we don't know, whether or not indeed someone will challenge. They have told us there are processes. So let's look at the implementation of the new law. Vusi, what are some of the practical challenges you expect the IEC to pay attention to in implementing this new law?
I mean, for instance, we will have more a longer ballot in this case. I mean, the fact that people independent candidates will be allowed to contest. It means that the IEC will have now to create a ballot. Again, this is a contentious issue because we've had a number of political parties mushrooming over the last 12 months or so, 12 months to 18 months. I mean, even today, a new political party was formed. So how the IEC accommodates existing political parties while ensuring that there's room for independent candidates, that's one of it. And since the current amendment bill is not really a new electoral system, it's still a proportional representation system, meaning that there will be questions around a section where there are independent candidates, or they'll still be placed alphabetically. So those may be some of the concerns, especially to independent candidates, because one thing that has been an issue in South Africa is the issue of party identification, or the identifiers of a party of choice, to say how will independent candidates able to maneuver those dynamics when they're in the same ballot as political parties. So those are some of the challenges that the electoral participation around the issue of campaigning. We know that the independent candidate is very strict around, electoral laws. We have an entire electoral court around that. So how does the electoral court now accommodate independent candidates? Already it's difficult for independent candidates to contest. So if ever we head into the 2024 elections with this current bill that has been signed, it will pose a challenge to say, how do they maneuver? Because it's not a new electoral system. It's an old electoral system that accommodates a different dynamic.
Indeed. Benedict, what are some of the legal hurdles that you see come in the way of the IEC and by extension the electoral system of South Africa because of this new law, or because of the implementation of this new law?
I don't foresee that there'll be many legal challenges against the IEC, because theirs would really be simply to implement the law as it is. I think, just to add to Vusi's points around some of the practical issues that will come up when independent candidates seek to contest under this amendment bill. For instance, there's a curious provision in the bill that provides that, even though you're an independent candidate, for you to contest an election as an independent candidate, you would have had to have been a member of a political party within the 3 months prior to your nomination, or when you put your name forward. I think that's problematic, because it effectively subsumes you into the mainstream of the political structure, which the whole point of this act is to radically shift. But more particularly problematic is how that becomes verified. From a practical perspective, there are a number of aspects that the IEC has to tick off to ensure that somebody is actually eligible to participate as a candidate. And something like that would seem to just add an unnecessary layer of complexity to a process that should actually be simple. So, from a practical perspective, I foresee that as being an additional hurdle to some of the aspects that Vusi has mentioned. I think for the IEC, all it needs to do is really just sit back and implement the law as it is from Parliament or the Constitutional Court if it decides to write in certain provisions as part of its order. The IEC has been, relatively very well independent in this country. I don't think people have a problem with the IEC. I think they've been good at implementing their mandate and ensuring that elections go off in a free and fair manner. So I don't see challenges to the IEC itself, but certainly it will be a bumpy ride as this piece of legislation gets challenged over the next couple of months.
I see. Vusi, voter education is one of the things that people have mentioned because, again, for the South African voter, it will be the first time that in a very long while that they will be having the opportunity to vote for an independent candidate. And as the IEC has told us, the voter roll will look different. The ballots on which you thumbprint will look different. How do you expect the IEC to go about voter education so that people are properly aware of the changes to come?
I think voter education will be their biggest mission heading into the 2024 elections, primarily because of the context of the 2024 elections. They're going to be, I assume, the most hotly contested elections. So the IEC then has a duty, right, to make sure that it creates an environment where there are no there are no hurdles as far as maybe independent candidates feeling or observing an environment where the public is not conscientized enough about the existing ballot. Right. I mean, the IEC itself commissioned the Human Science Research Council in 2019 around party identifiers on its ballot. So it is a commission that has experience. It is a commission that has placed certain value on ensuring that citizens are able to identify their parties of choice, and now it will be their leaders of choice or independent candidates of choice. So they've done a research similar to that. So I do foresee that voter education will be their biggest campaigning heading into next year's election. I do foresee that they will also try to create an environment where there's a concerted effort from both political parties and independent candidates to even let their potential voters know of what type of ballot will be used, how to identify their political parties of choice. So I do foresee that in addition to electoral operation, the second biggest thing heading to next year's vote on the IEC's itinerary, should I say, would be voter education to ensure that they create a balanced view. They create a balanced ecosystem between political parties and independent candidates so that none does not feel annihilated over the other, because we know that the IEC delegates in a very complicated situation where sometimes it is attacked as seen because people tend to see it as an extension of a political party and things like that. Right. So it has to delegate in that type of a situation, but I trust them to do it.
I see. Benedict, what are you looking at the IEC on a bigger budget because of all the changes that it has to do in the process?
I would think, naturally that would follow. I'm obviously not very clued up with the internal IEC processes, but I think naturally this would follow. The printing of ballot papers is quite a task, the distribution of that, the constituencies. I think there is a question mark around the constituencies as they currently stand in the amendment bill, which some have said are too large for it to be effective for an independent candidate. So if we're seeing the court challenge, perhaps seek to include more constituencies, which has been a proposal on the cards for a lengthy period, as Vusi would have mentioned earlier, then, if we have a lot more constituencies, then theoretically you have a lot more voting stations. Independent candidates can also, in accordance with the bill, propose and nominate agents for these elections. So I don't know what the impact of that would be if you now all of a sudden have a few more agents that would normally be the case. So I think, from a budgetary perspective, those items are likely to trickle through because you're running effectively an election for more parties, if I can use that word loosely, than would have been the case normally, and potentially with a lot more constituencies than would have been the case under a normal national or provincial election.
Looking at all the things that the IEC has to do prior to the May 2024 elections, if we put litigation in the mix, it would appear that things could drag a little before the elections could take place. And so I come back to the concern around timing. Do you foresee a future where the May elections is postponed, Benedict?
I think constitutionally the elections must happen within a specific period. I think it would be wrong legally for that period to be extended for any reason. So I foresee that the elections will happen within the period between March and August next year, and the Independent Electoral Commission will just have to make do with the amount of time that would have been afforded to it coming after these legal challenges, depending on when they end. I think that is likely to be the situation, and that was really the situation in the local government elections as well. And I think even following the outcome of these legal challenges, that's what the Independent Electoral Commission will have to sit with. It's unfortunate, but I think it'll just have to make do with the time and the period it has to ensure that we have a free and fair election following the outcome of these legal challenges.
I see. I want us to wrap up on this conversation, and while we're doing that, let's talk about the importance of having independent candidates in the polity of South Africa. Vusi, why is it important that this legislation is implemented and implemented correctly?
It is important because, firstly, people must note that the current existing electoral system was never meant to be used beyond 1999, right? That's why former President Thabo Mbeki commissioned the Electoral Reform Task Team 2003, also known as the Slabet Commission, to look at the feasibility of reforming the electoral system. Even Nelson Mandela himself, on his last address to Parliament, said that there must be a discussion around reforming the electoral system, and reason being improving the relationship of public representatives with the people on the ground. The current electoral system makes members of parliament, makes public representatives to be aloof. They are not in touch with people on the ground. They are more accountable. They are more responsive to their political parties rather than the citizens on the ground. And we find a situation where political party initiatives take precedence over the constitution. And we've had an instance where even the constitution has come out to say parliament has failed in its constitutional duty to hold the executive accountable. This is because political parties ordinarily have the hold over the people who represent them on the National Assembly. Under the current existing electoral system, political parties own the seat and not the member of parliament. And seen that if ever members of parliament try to toe constitution over party line, they are disciplined. So this current electoral, it's good that we have a debate around electoral reform, but it must be executed well to the T to ensure that what the Van Slabet Commission envisioned is realized, to ensure that on one hand, we do have proportional representation to have a representation of the broad demographics of the population, but on the other, we have parliament and provincial legislatures that are responsive to the people, so that the people on the ground can be able to hold the people who represent them accountable.
I see. Benedict, I know earlier you mentioned perhaps there could be the need to create new constitutions. There are those who have argued that there is no time to do that. But what would be the importance of that bit if, you know, the IEC is able to do that alongside implementing, you know, the new electoral reforms? What would be the importance of that?
And what Vusi has alluded to is very important, because the genesis of this electoral reform finds itself in the Constitution itself, because every citizen has a right to run for public office, and that's a constitutionally entrenched right. But what you have, based on the current system, is that your running for office is subsumed under a political party's directives, and you cannot effectively give proper effect to that right to run for political office. So this electoral reform finds itself within that particular right and the right to equality in the Constitution. So it's very important that this is actually done and is actually implemented correctly to ensure that, you know, the Constitution we have is not just a piece of paper, but it actually gives effect to real and tangible effects for the citizens of South Africa in participating in a democracy that can be responsive to their needs.
Benedict and Vusi, thank you so much for your time here. I do appreciate your insights on the subject matter.
Thank you.
Benedict and Vusi joined us from South Africa. We've been discussing electoral reforms that have come up in that country. It would seem that we are a long way away from implementation. We'll keep an eye on how developments go with the recent litigation around that, and you know, bring you the story as and when new developments emerge. But that'll be all today on The Square. I hope to see you same time tomorrow here. I am Keminni. Amanor. Bye.